He didn't even knock. Silas Venn shoved the gate open so hard it cracked against the post, and he walked onto Elowen Rusk's property like he already owned it. She was on her knees in the garden, hands in the dirt, when she heard the wood split. She stood slowly. Her back ached. It always ached. But she stood. 20 mules, Silas said, not as a question. Stopped 6 feet from her and looked her up and down the way a man looks at livestock he's already decided to reject. You spent what little Harlan left you on 20 mules. Nobody in this county would take for free. Elowen wiped her hands on her apron. They're on my land, she said. That makes them my business. Silas laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. Elowen. He said her name like a sigh, like disappointment. A woman your size, alone out here, with 80 acres already bleeding you dry, and you bought mules. She didn't answer. She had learned in the 6 years since Harlan died that some men interpret silence as surrender. Silas was one of them. He was wrong. Before we go any further into Elowen's story, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Stories like Elowen's are why we're here, the ones history almost forgot. About ordinary people who did extraordinary things when no one believed they could. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you like it, share it and stay with us until the very end. You will not regret it now. Let's go back to Hollow Creek, Tennessee, the fall of 1911, and a woman everyone in town had already written off. Elowen Rusk was 39 years old that autumn, and she had stopped caring what she looked like to other people approximately 4 years earlier. Not because she'd given up, that's what Silas Venn and his kind believed, and they were wrong about almost everything. She had stopped caring because caring had cost her too much energy she couldn't afford to spend. She was a heavy woman. She had always been heavy, even as a girl, and Hollow Creek had never let her forget it. When she was young, it was the other children. When she married Harlan Rusk and moved on to the farm, it was the neighbors' wives. After Harlan died of a fever in the winter of 1905, leaving her with 83 acres, a mule already too old to work hard, a mortgage she could barely service, and no children to help, the commentary changed its shape but not its spirit. People didn't say she was too fat anymore. They said she was struggling. They said the farm was too much for her. They said she needed help, by which they meant she needed a man, and by which they really meant she needed to sell the land to someone who could use it properly. Elowen did not sell the land. She worked it. She hired day labor when she could afford it, which was not often. She learned to do things herself that she had never done before: mending harness leather, patching the barn roof, reading the sky for rain, negotiating at the feed store with enough confidence that the younger men behind the counter eventually stopped trying to overcharge her. She made mistakes. Some of them cost her real money. One bad decision about seed corn in the spring of 1908 nearly broke her. Nearly. She came back from it. What the people of Hollow Creek saw when they looked at Elowen Rusk was a large, plain, middle-aged widow working land that was slowly losing ground. What they could not see because they were not looking was the quality of her attention. Elowen Rusk noticed things. She always had. It was the thing Harlan had loved about her first, before he loved anything else. You see what's actually there, he used to say, not what you expect to find. She saw what was actually there, which is why, in the summer of 1910, when a farm wagon sank hub-deep into the mud on the Cartwright Road, and a team of mules pulled it free while every man standing around argued about the best way to use the block and tackle, Elowen stood at the side of the road for 30 minutes in the heat and watched those mules work. She wasn't watching the wagon. She was watching the feet. The lead mule, an older animal, dark bay, with a white sock on one rear leg, and the permanent expression of a creature that had seen considerable foolishness in its time, was not pulling straight. It was not pulling hard, it was feeling. Each step was a question. Soft here, harder there. This ground will hold. This ground will not. The animal moved laterally, searching, and when it found the angle it wanted, it settled its weight and pulled with everything it had. The wagon came free in about 11 seconds. Elowen drove home thinking about feet. She was still thinking about feet 3 months later when she rode down to the edge of her south property line and stood looking at the creek bottomland she had never once successfully worked. 112 acres. That's what the deed said. Elowen's land extended from her productive hillside fields all the way down to Broken Creek, and the bottomland soil down there dark, almost black, rich with decades of organic matter, was some of the finest earth in the entire county. Her father had told her so when she was a girl. He'd shown her a handful of it once, lifting it up so she could see the color, smell the density of it. That soil, he'd said, could grow anything. He'd dreamed of farming it himself. He never had. Nobody had. Not in living memory, because it was a swamp. Not a dramatic swamp, not standing water in most seasons, not cattails and frogs, and truly hopeless ground. Just marshy enough to be unusable. The water table sat too high. The ground was soft and treacherous and would not support the weight of heavy equipment. 2 farmers before Elowen had tried. One had sunk a tractor to its axles and spent 3 days getting it out. The other had simply given up after the first season. Everyone agreed the bottomland was worthless. Elowen stood at its edge and thought about that mule's feet. Soft here, harder there. This ground will hold. She went home and started making calculations she did not share with anyone. The mules arrived on a Tuesday in September of 1911, driven up from a dispersal sale in the next county next by a man named Dolph Keener, who charged her $40 for delivery and spent the entire transaction looking at her like he expected her to change her mind. She didn't change her mind. 20 mules. Some young, some middle-aged by mule standards, a few older. 2 were half-broke and skittish. One had a bad habit of biting that she would deal with in time. They were, collectively, the animals that serious buyers had passed over the leftover lot, the ones without papers, the ones that required patience most men didn't have. Elowen walked the fence line while they settled into her pasture. She watched each one. By the end of that first afternoon, she had already decided that the big dark bay older mule, the one that stood slightly apart and watched her back with calm brown eyes, was going to be her lead animal. She didn't know his name. The sale records just called him Lot 14. She called him Temper because when she offered him her hand to smell, he took his time about it in a way that suggested he had standards. The young one, cream-colored, thin through the chest, still restless in the way young animals are restless when they have more energy than wisdom, she called Flint, because she could see the spark in him. She could also see that the spark needed serious direction before it was useful to anyone. Hollow Creek took approximately 48 hours to form a complete opinion. It was Mrs. Dorothea Crail who stopped Elowen outside the dry goods store on Thursday morning. Dorothea Crail was a woman of 60-something who had appointed herself the voice of reasonable concern in Hollow Creek approximately 30 years earlier and had never relinquished the post. "Elois," she said, using the same tone she used for announcements of mild regional disasters. "I heard about the mules." "I imagine you did," Elowen said. 20 of them." "Yes." Dorothea leaned in slightly, as though sharing something private, though half the sidewalk could hear her. "Honey, people are talking. I mean, where does a woman in your position even get that kind of money?" "By saving it," Elowen said, "and by not spending it on things I don't need." That landed somewhere in the vicinity of a bruise, because Dorothea Crail was known for her spending on things she didn't need. Dorothea recovered quickly, she always did. "It's just that mules are—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Old-fashioned Elowen. Everyone's moving to tractors now. Even the Holmgren boys just bought a new one. You can't run a modern farm on mule power." "Then it's fortunate," Elowen said, picking up her package from the store counter, "that I'm not trying to run a modern farm." She left before Dorothea could respond. It felt good for approximately 30 seconds. Then the doubt came in. That was the part nobody saw the walk home, the doubt. The 3 hours that night, lying awake on Harlan's side of the bed, which she still didn't use, running numbers in her head that could still come out wrong. She had spent money she had taken years to save. She was feeding 20 animals on top of everything else. If she was wrong about the bottomland, if the soil wasn't what she believed it was, if the drainage couldn't be fixed, if the mules couldn't do what she needed them to do, she wouldn't just fail. She would lose everything Harlan had worked for and everything she had fought to hold on to for 6 years. She lay in the dark and let herself feel that. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and went back to her notes. Silas Venn's visit came on the fourth day. He was 44, prosperous, and owned the largest operating farm in the Hollow Creek area, nearly 400 acres of good upland ground. He was not a cruel man in the way that requires real effort. He was the kind of man who has been right often enough that he has stopped seriously considering the possibility of being wrong. He had bought land from 2 widows before Elowen, fairly and legally, had accepted at prices because they believed him when he said the land was worth no more. Elowen was aware of this history. So when he walked onto her property without knocking and looked her up and down like she was a poor investment, she was not surprised. She was not even particularly angry. She was noting it, filing it away. The way she noted and filed away everything. Elowen. He stood with his thumbs in his suspenders. "I'm going to be straight with you." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Can't make those animals pay. Not 20 of them. Not on this property. The upland's decent, but it's not going to support that kind of overhead, and the bottomland." He shook his head. "I don't know what idea you've got about that ground, but I've heard you've been spending time down there. Whatever you're thinking, it's not going to work. That soil's ruined. Always has been." "How do you know?" Elowen asked. He blinked. It was clearly not the question he'd expected, because everyone knows it. "Been that way since before your father's time." "Since before my father's time," she repeated. "And in that whole stretch of time, has anyone actually dug down into it? Looked at what's underneath? Looked at why it drains the way it does?" Silas opened his mouth and then closed it again. That was answer enough. "I appreciate you coming by, Silas," Elowen said. "I know you mean well." He didn't leave immediately. He stood there a moment longer, looking at her, and something shifted in his expression, not quite concern, but something in that neighborhood. Something that might have been the very beginning of uncertainty. Then he put his hat back on and walked to his horse. "You're going to run out of money before spring," he called back. "Maybe so," she said. She watched him ride out the gate. Then she looked at her 20 mules grazing in the pasture and felt something she couldn't quite name, something that sat between fear and determination, close enough to both that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. She had told Silas she appreciated him coming by. She was not entirely sure that was true. What was true was this: everything she had said to him she had meant. And everything she had said was built on something nobody in Hollow Creek knew she possessed. She went inside and took the old journal down from the shelf above the kitchen window. Her father's handwriting faded now, covering pages he'd filled in over decades of thinking about that bottomland. Sketches of drainage patterns, notes on soil samples, a faded diagram that took her 3 readings to fully understand. And near the back, in careful, small letters, a note about a tile-lay system that had once drained the field built by hand, generations back, abandoned when a junction broke and nobody thought it worth fixing. Nobody had thought it worth fixing. Elowen traced the diagram with one finger in the lamplight. Maybe nobody had thought it worth fixing, because nobody had understood what it would mean if it were fixed. She understood. She closed the journal and set it gently on the table. Outside in the dark pasture, 20 unwanted mules stood in the cool Tennessee air, and Elowen Rusk, the woman, everyone in Hollow Creek had already counted out, sat down to plan what came next. The journal stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days, before Elowen allowed herself to look at it again, not because she was afraid of what it contained. She had already memorized the important parts of the drainage diagram, the notes in her father's careful hand, the small faded sketch of the junction point that had apparently failed sometime in the late 1880s and never been repaired. She could have drawn it from memory. She had been drawing it from memory, in fact, on the back of old seed invoices, while she sat at the table after supper, tracing and retracing the shape of a system she had never seen with her own eyes. She left the journal alone because she needed to think without looking at it. Looking at it made her feel like she was already committed, and she wasn't ready to feel committed yet. Commitment, in her experience, had a way of narrowing a person's vision right when they needed it widest. So she thought, and she watched the mules. Watching the mules was, at this stage, the most important work she was doing, though it would not have looked like work to anyone passing the fence line. It looked like a heavy, middle-aged woman leaning on a fence post, doing nothing in particular. Elowen was accustomed to looking like she was doing nothing in particular when she was doing the most important thing available. She learned temper first, because temper was the one she needed to understand. The old Dark Bay mule had a personality that reminded her, in a way she would never say out loud because it would have sounded foolish of her mother. Patient on the surface, observant underneath. Willing to the person asking showed some basic evidence of having thought things through. The moment that evidence disappeared, cooperation did too, and no amount of pressure would bring it back. Elowen brought Temper a piece of dried apple on the second morning and stood at the fence while the mule considered her. Temper took the apple. Then she took a slow step forward and put her nose against Elowen's coat pocket, checking for more. "That's all there is," Elowen told her. Temper pulled back and looked at her. "I know," Elowen said. "I'd want more too. That was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that." Flint was harder. The young cream-colored mule was not mean. Elowen had seen mean animals and recognized the difference, but he was the kind of young that doesn't know yet what it doesn't know, which is its own kind of danger. He had energy without direction, speed without judgment, and a tendency to test every boundary not out of malice, but out of a pure, restless need to understand where the edges were. On the third day he got out of the south pasture, through a gap she hadn't noticed in the fence lines, and spent 2 hours in her kitchen garden, eating the last of the fall greens before she found him. She stood in the ruined garden looking at him. He looked back at her with no apparent guilt, a piece of kale hanging from one side of his mouth. "You and I," Elowen said, "are going to have a long conversation about patience." Flint dropped the kale and moved toward her. She held her ground. He stopped 2 feet away, sniffed her hand, and then exhaled through his nose in a way that suggested he found her mildly interesting, but not alarming. She patched the fence that afternoon, and she started spending an extra hour each evening, working specifically with Flint, not breaking him harder, not punishing the energy out of him, but trying to give it somewhere to go. She had read enough about mules to know that the ones with the most fire, handled right, became the most useful animals on a farm. Handled wrong, they became dangerous problems. The difference was almost entirely in whether the handler had more patience than the animal. Elowen had been practicing patience for 6 years. She had considerable reserves. The other 18 mules arranged themselves in her attention according to their individual demands. 2 of the younger ones, a matched pair of dark grays, she called Wick and Wander, because they were always together and always going somewhere they weren't supposed to, needed the fence reinforced twice in the first week. An older brown mule with a permanently skeptical expression she named Sober proved to be so steady and reliable that she could put him next to any of the others, and whatever nervousness existed in that animal would quietly reduce, as if it simply did not have room in his worldview for unnecessary drama. She filed that away. Sober would be useful in difficult terrain. The biter, a compact, muscular roan mule with a short back and quick reflexes, was the one she'd spent the most careful time around in those early weeks. His name, she decided, was Cinder, because everything about him was compressed heat, waiting for an outlet. He had not yet bitten her, but he had made the gesture twice, snapping at air near her arm with enough conviction that she understood it was not bluffing. She didn't flinch either time, which seemed to confuse him. It was not fearless. She was afraid of being bitten. Actually, a mule bite is not a minor injury, and she had nobody nearby to drive her to a doctor in a hurry. But she understood that showing fear to Cinder was worse than the bite itself, because fear would teach him that the gesture worked, and a lesson learned that way sticks. She managed him with distance and consistency. She never put herself in a bad position around him, never came up from behind without warning, never reached over his head. She was simply present, predictably, without drama, until being around her was so routine that he stopped treating it as a reason for aggression. Took 5 weeks. Then one morning she was filling his water trough, and he walked up beside her and stood there, not touching her, not making any gesture, just standing. She kept filling the trough. He kept standing. When she finished and picked up the bucket to leave, he took 2 steps to follow her, then stopped, as if he'd surprised himself. "Well," she said. Cinder looked away, as if he hadn't done anything at all. She walked back to the barn with the empty bucket and let herself feel, just briefly, that this was going the way she needed it to go. Then she went inside and looked at the drainage diagram again. It was late October when she first walked the full perimeter of the bottomland. She had been to its windows were dark. She had been to its edges many times, but she had not walked the whole thing, not methodically, not with the attention she was now applying to everything. She went alone, early in the morning before the day's work could find her, wearing the heaviest boots she owned and carrying a long stick she used to test ground ahead of each step. The bottomland was not, from a distance, obviously terrible. This was part of why it had fooled people for generations into thinking it was almost fixable. It looked like a field, rough, overgrown with sedge grass and scrub willow, and the kind of flat-leafed weeds that prefer wet feet, but a field. You had to get into it before you understood why no one worked it. Elowen got into it. By the time she had gone 40 feet from the dry ground at the edge, her right boot had sunk to the ankle twice. Not dramatically, no sudden plunge, no sucking sound, just a slow, inevitable settling, the ground giving way under her weight like it was deciding it didn't owe her anything. She pulled out, tested ahead with the stick, found a firmer line, moved forward. She was paying attention to texture. The way a good eye on uncertain ground learns to read the surface, the places where the grass grew differently, where the color of the soil was slightly changed, where the ground vegetation thinned in a way that suggested water sitting permanently just below. She had learned some of this from farming. Some of it she was learning right now. She had gone perhaps 200 yards into the field, working toward a low line of willows that marked the creek, when the stick found something, not mud, not firm ground either, something in between, with a different quality underkins of solidity under the surface layer of soft that didn't feel like the bottomland she had been testing. Pressed down harder. The stick hit something. She stepped carefully to the spot, tested it, with her full weight, shifted slowly forward, and found that it held. She took another step. It held there too. She stopped and looked at the ground beneath her boots, then looked ahead along what she could now feel was a slightly different line, not wide, maybe 3 feet across, maybe less, running roughly in the direction of the old property line. She followed it for another 100 yards, testing and moving, testing and moving. She lost it twice and had to backtrack and find it again. It was not straight. It curved twice in ways she couldn't immediately explain. When she finally turned around and looked back toward her dry land, she was standing on something that had held her weight, all of her weight, without apology for nearly a quarter mile into the bottomland. She stood there with the cold October air coming off the creek and understood, slowly, what she was standing on. A road. Not a proper road. Not anymore. But the remains of one packed earth and likely stone fill underneath, laid down by someone who had needed to move through this field regularly, the surface now buried under decades of silt and vegetation, but the foundation still present, still there, still firm enough to hold a person if they could find it. Her father's journal hadn't mentioned a road, but her father's notes had mentioned movement references to equipment being brought in for how the tile work, which meant there had to have been a way to bring that equipment in. You don't haul drainage tile through waist-deep mud. You need a firm line, and someone at some point had built one. She stood on the buried road and thought about mule feet. Soft here, harder there. This ground will hold. She had been thinking all along that the mules would need to find a way in. She had been thinking about it as a problem of navigation, the animals feeling their way through the uncertain ground, the way she'd watched that lead mule do on Cartwright Road. But if there was a road already there, even a buried one, even a forgotten one, the problem was different. Problem was not finding a path. The problem was uncovering one. She walked back to dry ground with mud on her boots, and her mind running ahead of her faster than her legs could carry her. She told nobody. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because she had learned, specifically and at some cost, that ideas shared too early in Hollow Creek had a way of coming back to their owner in distorted form, attached to other people's skepticism and other people's certainty, and the composite result was usually an idea that had been so thoroughly processed by community opinion that the original was no longer visible. She needed to be sure first, so she spent the next 2 weeks making sure. She went back to the bottomland 4 more times before November, always early, always alone, mapping the buried road in sections and recording what she found in a separate notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer under the good tablecloth. The road went further than she'd first estimated, nearly 350 yards in a curving line before it seemed to end near a stand of old sycamores. She wasn't sure if it simply ended there or if it continued in a direction she hadn't found yet. She drew it as accurately as she could. Then she went back to the journal and looked at the drainage diagram with the road in mind. The junction, the failed point in the tile system, was marked roughly in her father's notes. He had written down his estimate of where it was based on conversations with an old man who had worked on the original tile lay as a young laborer. The estimate was not precise, but when Elowen overlaid what she now knew about the buried road with the location her father had estimated, they were close. Very close. Close enough that she started to think the road and the junction were related. That someone had built that road not just for general access, but specific service to the drainage system to bring equipment in for maintenance, that at some point had simply stopped being done. She sat with this for a long time. The nights were getting cold. She could hear the mules in the pasture sometimes, moving around, the occasional sound of one of them settling, and those sounds had started to feel less like livestock and more like company, which was not something she examined too closely because she knew how it would sound. She was alone on this farm. She had been alone on it for 6 years. The aloneness was not a tragedy. She had stopped thinking of it that way, but it was a fact. And sometimes facts are heavy in the dark. She relit the lamp after midnight one Thursday, November, and read her father's notes again, every page, from front to back. There was a passage near the middle, not about the drainage, not about the soil, just an observation he had written while she was still a small child, she could tell by the date. He had written, "The bottomland wants to be farmed. It has everything a field needs. It is only waiting for the problem that stopped it to be found and corrected. I believe its windows were dark. I believe it is a drainage problem, and who is not in a hurry and who looks carefully enough will find the answer already buried in the ground." She read it 3 times. Then she closed the journal, set it back on the table, and went to bed, and this time she slept. December came, and with it came mud season on the upland fields, which meant the work shifted from the bottomland in her mind to the immediate and unignorable demands of getting 20 mules through a Tennessee winter without going broke doing it. This was not a small logistical problem. She had budgeted for it, but budgets and reality maintain a complicated relationship, and reality won 2 of their early arguments that winter. The first was about hay she had contracted for a price that the supplier then raised, citing a bad cutting season, and the number she was able to negotiate down to was still higher than she'd planned. The second was about a broken axle on the old farm cart, which took 4 days to repair because the part she needed had to come from the county seat by wagon, and the man who could work iron well enough to do the job spent 2 of those 4 days unavailable, for reasons Elowen did not press him on. She paid what she had to pay. She did not pretend she wasn't bothered by it. The mules ate. The cart got fixed. The winter moved forward. She continued working with them every day. She had started, in November, doing basic harness training with the ones who needed it, which was most of them. The previous owner, whoever had assembled this lot for the sale, had not been a careful trainer. Its windows. The animals knew the fundamental idea of pulling. They did not know it well, and they did not know it together, which was what Elowen needed them to know. Teamwork in mules is not a given. You cannot simply put 4 animals on a single piece of equipment and expect them to function as a unit. They have to learn each other, the same way people do. They have to understand where the others are, what they'll do, how they move. And the person driving has to understand all of it simultaneously. Elowen was not a small woman trying to manage large animals. She was an experienced farmer with a precise understanding of leverage, positioning, and the very specific kind of authority that works on mules, which is the kind that never raises its voice and never loses its temper, and never, ever breaks a promise to the animal that a thing will be manageable if they just hold on a little longer. Mules remember promises, and they remember broken ones. She started with temper and sober. That pair was almost immediate. They moved together with minimal fuss, as if they had been waiting for someone to give them a reasonable job. Then she added Wick. Wick was good in harness once he understood that Temper was in charge, and that questioning Temper's decisions was not productive. Then Wander, because separating Wick and Wander had proved more trouble than it was worth. 4 mules, a good working team. Not her whole herd, but the beginning of what she actually needed for the bottomland work. Flint she kept working separately. He wasn't ready for a team yet, and putting an unready animal in harness with others is how injuries happen. She was building his patience the way you build a fire in damp wood slowly, without rushing, feeding it just enough to keep it going. Cinder she assessed carefully for 3 weeks before she put him in harness for the first time, and when she did it alone in the small paddock, and she stood 6 feet to his left with the lines loose, and just waited for him to do whatever he was going to do with the new weight and constraint around him. He didn't bite anyone. He didn't panic. He stood rigid for about 2 minutes, then shook himself from ears to tail like a dog coming out of water, and then moved forward 1 step when she asked him to, and stopped when she asked him to stop. She scratched his ears carefully from the side. He allowed it, which was the most he had allowed yet. "I knew it," she told him. "I knew you had it in you." He didn't respond. He was a mule, not a show animal. But he didn't walk away either, and she counted that. The winter talk in Hollow Creek, as winter talk tends to do, had settled into a set of fixed opinions about Elowen and her mules that had hardened into something close to town consensus. The consensus was roughly as follows. She had made a bad purchase with money she couldn't afford. She would not be able to manage 20 animals through the winter without help she hadn't arranged for, and by spring she would either be selling the farm or coming to someone Silas Venn's name was mentioned in this context quite often with her hat in her hand. Elowen heard pieces of this through the natural osmosis by which small towns communicate. She heard it if its windows were dark. She heard from the feed store owner's teenage son, who didn't realize she could hear him talking to another boy about what his father had said at supper. She heard it from a woman at the dry goods counter who leaned over and said, with genuine warmth, that if things got difficult, there were people who would be willing to help, by which she meant people who would be willing to buy, at prices they set. She heard it from Silas Venn himself, indirectly, through a comment he made to the pastor after Sunday service that was repeated to her by the pastor's wife, who genuinely meant to be kind and only succeeded about halfway. She let none of it move her. This was not indifference. It was something more difficult than indifference. It was active choice made every morning to put attention where it was useful rather than where it was painful. Elowen had feelings about what people said. She was not a stone. But she had learned that feelings about other people's opinions are like bad weather. You can't stop it. You can dress for it. And you absolutely cannot afford to let it keep you inside when there's work to be done outside. She worked. January turned to February. The worst of the cold passed without anything catastrophic happening, which felt like more of an achievement than it probably sounded. All 20 mules were healthy. The hay held. The cart axle held. The bank payment for February was made on time and in full, which cost her the last of what she'd set aside for unexpected expenses, which meant that from this point forward, every problem that arose would require a creative solution. She started looking at the buried road differently, as February warmed slightly toward its end. She had been tracking it in her memory, building a mental map of where it ran and what was above it. Now she started thinking about what she needed to do to it. She didn't need to excavate it fully. That would take months and more labor than she had. What she needed was to clear what was on top of it, the brush, the sedge, the accumulated years of debris, enough that the mules could find the firmer surface beneath and walk on it, and then use it to haul equipment and material into the field. She went out there on a Tuesday in late February, alone again, and she started pulling brush with her hands. She worked for 2 hours before her back told her, quite firmly, that she had reached her limit for the day. She had cleared about 40 feet of the surface above the buried road, not a dramatic amount. Not an amount that anyone watching would have found impressive, and she stood with her arms aching and her boots wet and looked at what 40 feet looked like in the context of a field that went for several hundred yards more, and she breathed slowly through her nose for a moment. Then she went home, had supper, rubbed her hands with the liniment she kept for joints and muscle, and planned what she was going to do differently in the morning. Differently meant slower. Differently meant a long-handled brush hook she'd been keeping in the barn for jobs like this. Differently meant accepting that 40 feet was actually progress, and not diminishing it because it wasn't 200. She had told Flint early in his training that patience was the only tool that always worked, if you were willing to use it long enough. She believed it for the mule. She needed to believe it for herself. By mid-March, she had cleared nearly half the surface of the buried road. The work had shifted from purely hand labor to something more organized. She was using temper and sober now to haul brush away, which was a decision that had come out of watching Temper stand calmly in the cleared section one morning while Elowen was resting and noticing that the mule seemed entirely unbothered by the terrain. The bottomland, at least in the cleared corridor, was firmer than it looked. The buried road held the weight well. She hitched the old farm cart one morning and drove Temper and Sober in along the cleared path, and they went without drama, testing as they moved, finding that the ground held, and she sat on the cart seat with the lines in her hands and felt the particular physical sensation of something working the way she had believed it could work, which is one of the most sustaining feelings available to a person who has spent months working in the direction of a theory. She didn't let herself celebrate, not yet, but she allowed herself to notice it. That same week, the first person found out what she was doing. His name was Burrell Oakes, and he was 63 years old, and owned a small piece of land adjacent to the bottomland's eastern edge. He was not by temperament a gossip. He was quiet in the way that some men who have worked outdoors their whole lives become quiet, which is a different thing from being secretive or unfriendly. He had seen Elowen going down toward the bottomland several mornings in a row, and one afternoon he walked his fence line into the corner where it met hers and waited until she came back out. She saw him from a distance and walked toward him, because there was no point in doing otherwise. "Morning," she said when she reached the fence. "Morning." He looked past her toward the field. "What are you doing down in there?" "Clearing brush," she said, which was true, just not all of it. He was quiet for a moment. He had the unhurried manner of someone who knew that rushing a conversation didn't make it arrive any sooner. "Found the old road," he said finally. It was not a question. She looked at him. "You know about it?" "My daddy knew about it. He told me once when I was a boy. Said there used to be a way and said somebody'd put it in for the tile lay work, way back. I figured it was gone by now." He squinted at the field. "Still there?" "Parts of it," Elowen said carefully. He nodded slowly. He looked at her, then back at the field, then at the two mules, standing patiently at the edge of the cleared path. "You're trying to get to the tile junction," he said. She said nothing. He looked at her again. "Elowen, I've known about that junction being broke since my daddy told me what killed that field. I thought about fixing it myself 20 years ago. Couldn't figure out a way to get equipment in there." He paused. "You figured it out with mules." "I'm trying," she said. Burrell was quiet for a long time. A crow called somewhere back in the tree line. The morning air had that particular March quality, cold enough to see your breath, but carrying inside it the faint promise that this would eventually stop. "You're going to need help," he said at last. "When you find the junction, you're going to need somebody who knows tile work." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward his own land without another word. She watched him go, and she felt something shift very slightly in the weight of what she was doing. She still didn't know exactly what it meant that someone else knew. But Burrell Oakes was not Silas Venn. He was not Dorothea Crail. He was not anyone who would take what he knew and use it in ways she hadn't invited. He was just a man who had known about a broken drainage junction for 20 years and had never been able to do anything about it. She turned back toward the bottomland and looked at the mules. Temper turned her head and looked back. "Let's go," Elowen said. She picked up the brush hook and walked in. Burrell Oakes did not come back the next day or the day after that. Elowen did not expect him to. Men like Burrell processed things slowly and then acted with conviction, and the space between the processing and the action was his own business. She respected that. She had her own processing to do. What stayed with her from their conversation at the fence line was not what he had said about the junction, though that mattered. What stayed with her was the specific thing he had said about equipment. He had thought about fixing it himself 20 years ago. Couldn't figure out how to get equipment in. He had come to the same wall she had come to and stopped there, and after 20 years had simply accepted the wall as permanent. Elowen understood that feeling. She had stood at her own version of it more than once. The difference, and she did not think of herself as better than Burrell Oaks for it, just different, in whatever particular way her nature had arranged itself, was that she could not seem to accept a wall as permanent until she had walked its full length and looked at it from every angle. It was possibly an exhausting way to be. Harlan had called it the most aggravating and most admirable thing about her, in roughly equal measure, kept clearing. Through the last 2 weeks of March, she worked the brush path almost every morning and some afternoons, and the mules worked it with her, and slowly the buried road extended its visible self further into the bottomland. It was not clean work. Nothing about the bottomland was clean. The sedge grass she was cutting back had roots that went down further than she expected and grabbed her boots when she stepped wrong, and the brush tangled in the hook and came free in sudden lurching pulls that made her stagger. She fell twice, once in the mud, which was unglamorous and cold, and required 20 minutes of cleaning before she could get back to work. Once sideways into the cut brush, which caught her coat sleeve and tore it at the elbow. She repaired She repaired the sleeve that evening with the brown thread that didn't quite match the coat fabric, and wore it anyway. The path was nearly 280 yards by the end of March, and she was close enough to sycamores to smell the creek on cold mornings. The ground in this section was wetter than what she'd worked through earlier, and the buried road here was narrower. She could feel it shifting slightly under the cart wheels when she brought Temper and Sober in to haul brush. Not dangerously, just enough to remind her that she was working at the tolerance of what the ground would permit, not the outer edge of what she was demanding of it. She slowed down in this section. She tested more carefully. She added Sober to the lead position ahead of Temper for a week, because Sober's particular talent for finding firm footing was more immediately useful here than Temper's authority. Temper, for her part, seemed to accept this demotion with the equanimity of a creature that understood the difference between hierarchy and usefulness. Cinder was working in harness regularly now, paired with one of the steadier middle-aged mules she called Bishop, named for a particular measured quality in his movement, like someone who had places to go but had decided long ago that dignity was worth the extra time. Cinder and Bishop were not a matched pair in any conventional sense, but they had arrived at an understanding. Cinder provided the force, and Bishop provided the direction, and together they hauled loads that would have challenged animals with better papers and worse sense. Flint remained her ongoing project. She had not put him in a working team yet. She had kept working him in the paddock and on short solo sessions along the upland fence line, and the patience she'd been building in him was real and growing. But it was still the patience of a young animal who had decided that patience was currently worth performing rather than the patience of one who had genuinely understood what it was for. There was a difference, and she knew the difference when she saw it, and she waited. She didn't rush Flint. She didn't rush any of it. The end of the month brought rain for 5 consecutive days, which pushed her out of the bottomland entirely and put her on the upland fields doing the spring preparation work that couldn't wait for better conditions. There was manure to spread before the ground was too wet. Winter, damage to assess in the fencing the early kitchen garden to get into the ground before the last frost window closed. She had not been neglecting the upland farm while she worked the bottomland. She had been doing everything, which meant she was always tired, in a way that had become background noise rather than an emergency. On the 3rd day of rain, she sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon, her boots dripping by the door, and did the accounts she'd been postponing. The numbers were honest, and honest meant uncomfortable. The hay bill had run higher than recovered. The February bank payment had been made, but the May payment was going to require that the spring crop come in solid and that she not have any surprises between now and then. She put the ledger book away and did not take it out again that evening. She ate supper, checked on the mules before dark, stood in the barn doorway listening to the rain on the roof, and 20 animals breathing and moving in their stalls and the pasture shelter, and made herself be specific about what she actually had. She had a buried road that was almost cleared to where she needed it to go. She had a team of mules that were working, genuinely working, better than she had let herself hope in September. She had her father's diagram. She had the basic understanding of what needed to be done when she found the junction, even if she could not do the technical tile work herself. She had kept the farm operating for 6 months with 20 animals nobody wanted, and a plan nobody knew about, and she had not broken, not sold, not given Silas Venn the satisfaction of being right. She stayed in the barn doorway for another few minutes. Then she went inside and went to sleep before 8 o'clock, which was a luxury she had stopped feeling guilty about sometime in November. The rain cleared on the 5th day, and 2 days after that, Burrell Oakes came back. He came in the afternoon this time, not to the fence line but to the front door, which meant he had made some decision that the fence line conversation had been preliminary to. He was carrying his hat in both hands, and he had the look of a man who had thought through what he was going to say and then revised it several times. Elowen offered him coffee, and he accepted. They sat at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking," he said. "I figured," she said, "about the tile work." He turned his hat in his hands. "There's a man, older fellow, lives about 12 miles east, out past the Whitmore property. Name's Orson Pike. He did tile lay work for 30 years, all over this part of the county. Tired he's 71, maybe 72. But he's the one who'd know what you're looking at down there. If you find the junction, he'd know what kind of repair it needs, and what materials and how long it'd take." He paused. "I've known him since I was young. He's not easy to deal with, but he's honest about what he knows and doesn't know, which is more than you can say for most." Elowen wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Does he know this bottomland?" "He knows about it. He's heard of it, I think. Whether he's been down here, I don't know." Burrell set his hat on the table. "I could take you out to talk to him if you want." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. Not offended, she'd said it plainly, and he was a plain man, and he appreciated plain. "My daddy believed that bottomland could be farmed," he said at last. "He talked about it for years. He never got to see it done. I'd like to see it done before I'm too old to see much of anything." He picked his hat back up. "And you've got further than anybody else ever did." So it wasn't a sentimental speech. It was the truth arranged efficiently, which Elowen respected more than sentiment anyway. "When can you take me?" she asked. "Saturday," he said. "The weather holds." The weather held. Orson Pike lived in a house that looked like it had been built by a man who cared more about useful than presentable, which described every surface of it. Porch sagged on one end. The vegetable garden beside it was the most methodically organized thing she'd seen since the county assessor's office. He was sitting on the porch when they arrived, in a chair that had been repaired with wire and a piece of board, reading something he closed when he saw the wagon coming. He was a thin man, tall even sitting, with hands that were larger than the rest of him seemed to require, and a face that had organized itself over 70-plus years into an expression of permanent, careful evaluation. He looked at Burrell. He looked at Elowen. "This the widow with the mules," he said. It was not phrased as a question, which meant word had traveled 12 miles, which was not surprising. Word in that part of Tennessee moved like weather. "Elowen Rusk," she said. "I appreciate you seeing me." "Didn't say I'd help you," he said. "Said I'd hear you." "That's all I'm asking," she said. He studied her for another moment. Then he gestured at the porch steps. "Sit down, then." She sat. Burrell sat on the edge of the porch railing. Orson settled back in his wired-together chair. She told him. Not everything, not the full history of the journal, or her father, or the years of watching and thinking. She told him the operational facts, the buried road, the bottomland, what the journal said about the tile system, where she estimated the junction was based on her father's diagram, and her own survey of the field, and what she had done so far to open access to it. Orson said nothing through all of this. He looked at the garden mostly, occasionally at her, once at Burrell, with an expression that Burrell received with a small, neutral nod. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. "Your father's diagram," he said. "You have it with you?" She had brought the journal. She took it out of the bag she'd carried and opened it to the page and handed it to him. He looked at it for a long time. He tilted it toward the light. He pressed his thumb against the corner of the page, which was his only physical response to anything. "This is old work," he said. "From the 1870s or 80s, as best we can tell," she said. "Looks like bream work," he said. "There was a family, the Breams, they did tile lay all through this county until the last one died. They had a particular way of laying the junction caps." He ran his thumb along the diagram. "If this is right, if the junction is where this says, and if it's bream work, the cap failed. That's what failed. Not the tiles themselves. The cap." He handed the journal back to her. Tiles like that, if the cap is replaced and the channel is cleared, they'll run. They ran for 20-30 years before the cap went. They'll run again. The morning was cold and bright, and a rooster, somewhere, behind the house was making its opinion of the morning known. Can you repair it? Elowen asked. I'm 71 years old, he said. I know. My knees are not what they were. I'm not asking you to dig, she said. I have mules. I have my own back, even if it complains about it. I'm asking if you know what needs to be done and can tell me while it's being done. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. You'd need materials, he said finally. Gravel. Replacement tile for whatever's broken at the cap. Mortar. That's weight. You're getting it in on a 3-foot wide path over soft ground with 2 mules. I have more than 2 mules, she said. I have 20. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same general neighborhood. So I heard, he said. He didn't say yes that morning. He said he'd think about it, which was not a no, and when they drove back toward Hollow Creek, Burrell told her that for Orson Pike, that was nearly the same thing. He'll come, Burrell said. He's been waiting for somebody to go after that junction for 20 years. He just didn't think it'd be a woman with mules. Nobody does, Elowen said. She found the junction at the beginning of April. It did not announce itself. There was no moment of dramatic discovery, no shine of metal or visible structure rising from the mud. What there was, instead, was this. She had gone further along the buried road than she had before, past the sycamores to a section where the ground was particularly soft on both sides of the path, and the vegetation was the thick, lush kind that grows where water never really leaves. She had been probing with a long steel rod she'd had the blacksmith make for her, specifically for this narrow enough to push into the ground without moving much soil, long enough to reach below the water table level. The rod had been going through soft earth all morning, finding nothing, and then it stopped. Not on stone, not on a root, on something that had edges, something that had been placed. She worked the rod in and out of 6 adjacent spots around the first contact, and every one of them found the same thing, a solid form, roughly 2 feet below the surface, running east to west. She got down on her knees in the mud, both knees, without ceremony, because there was nobody watching? And ceremony was not the point. And she pushed her hands into the ground above the contact point and cleared away what she could, and felt the edge of a clay tile with her fingers. It was intact, solid, not crumbling, still there after decades of being forgotten. She sat back in the mud and breathed. Then she looked east along the line of the buried tiles and west, and found by probing again the spot where the junction should have been. The junction tiles were there, but the configuration felt wrong, even through the rod. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the difference. The road had met a corner here, and the corner felt collapsed on one side, which meant the cap was gone or broken, exactly as Orson had said it might be. She stood up, mud on both knees and both hands and one forearm, and looked at the field around her. It was a field. That was the thing that kept striking her. Not a swamp, not a wasteland, a field with difficult drainage, and the cause of that difficulty was sitting 2 feet underground, waiting to be corrected. She went home and wrote everything down. Then she drove out to Orson Pike's. He was in the garden when she arrived, moving between rows with a deliberateness that acknowledged his knees without letting them make decisions for him. He looked up. He saw her face. You found it, he said. I found it, she said. He nodded slowly. He pushed the garden fork into the ground and left it standing. I'll need 2 days to get my materials together, he said. I've got some tile at the back of my property. Salvage from an old job. Might be enough. We'll need to see what we're actually dealing with before we know. Tell me what you need me to bring, she said. Gravel, he said. Clean gravel. Mortar clay, I'll show you the mix. The mules for hauling. He paused, and somebody else. I can direct and advise. I can do some of the close work around the cap. But you need somebody who can dig and not mind the mud, and it can't be just the 2 of us. She thought about it. I'll find someone, she said. He looked at her with the particular look of someone who has watched other people promise things for 7 decades and has learned to calibrate accordingly. I'll find someone, she repeated, more firmly. She found 2 men by Thursday. Not easily. The problem was not money. Exactly, she had offered a fair day wage for what would be 3-4 days of hard work in wet ground, And that was money she was moving from a category called reserve into a category called necessary, which meant the reserve category was now empty. The problem was that she needed men who could work without talking about what they were doing until it was done, because she had decided after considerable thought on the subject that she did not want Hollow Creek to know what was happening in the Bottomland until there was something finished to show for it. Opinion, she had learned at considerable cost, has a way of attaching itself to unfinished things and dragging at them. She found the men through Burrell, who found the men through his own networks, which were old and reliable and operated on the principle that some things are nobody's business except the people directly involved. They were brothers, late 20s and early 30s, strong and quiet and in need of the wage. Their name was Doss. They asked no questions beyond the practical ones: where, when, what tools to bring, and how long. She told them where and when and what tools. She told them it would be 3 days, possibly 4. She told them that the ground would be difficult and the work would be harder than it looked. The older one said, "We've worked harder." She believed him. They started on a Monday morning in the second week of April, and the first thing that went wrong was the gravel. She had arranged for a load to be brought in by a supplier from the county seat, scheduled for the Saturday before, and it had not arrived. Plyer's man came by Sunday evening to tell her the wagon had thrown a wheel on the Cartwright Road, and the load was delayed until Tuesday at the earliest, which meant they were starting the work with less gravel than she'd wanted for the base preparation. Orson heard this and was quiet for a moment. "We'll start at the junction and work back," he said. "We don't need the gravel first for the cap repair. We need it for the drain bed. We can do the cap first and grade the bed after the gravel comes." She looked at him. "Will that work?" "It'll work," he said. "It'll just mean more trips in and out." More trips meant more load on the mules. She looked at Temper and Sober and Cinder and Bishop, all 4 hitched and waiting with the first cartload of Orson's salvage tile and tools. Temper looked back at her with the expression of an animal that has made peace with complications. "Let's go," Elowen said. Getting Orson Pike into the Bottomland was its own exercise in managed difficulty. He moved with care, using a stout stick he'd brought for the purpose, and he navigated the path without complaint, but without pretending that his knees weren't communicating their displeasure at every wet, uneven step. The Doss brothers went ahead with the first cart, guided by Elowen, while Orson followed at his own pace. When they reached the junction site, Orson spent 20 minutes probing and clearing and looking before he said a word. The Doss brothers waited without fidgeting, which told her something good about them. She waited too. "Bream work," Orson said at last, almost to himself. He was crouched beside the partly exposed tiles, his big hands careful on the clay surface. "See here." He pointed to something she couldn't quite distinguish. The way they seeded the lateral, that's bream. Nobody else did it this way. He sat back on his heels with some effort. Cap split. Probably from frost, maybe 30 years ago, maybe longer. When it split, the water backed up instead of moving. And without the junction moving, the whole east lateral drowned out. He gestured along what would have been the drainage line. This field didn't fail. The cap failed. One piece. "One piece," Elowen said. "One piece," he confirmed. "That's the whole of it." The older Doss brother, whose name was Calvin, said, "How long to fix it?" Orson looked at the exposed tiles, then at the sky, then at his own hands. "If we do this right, 3 days," he said. "Maybe the 4th if we find surprises underground." He looked at Elowen. There are always surprises underground. He was right. The first surprise was the condition of the east lateral for the first 15 feet from the junction. The tiles there had not split. They were still structurally sound, but they had filled with silt, which meant they needed to be cleared before a repaired cap would do anything useful. This was not tile work. This was clearing work, which meant the Doss brothers spent the better part of Monday afternoon lying in the mud at angles that looked anatomically improbable, flushing silt out of tiles with a water siphon system Orson described, and they assembled with what materials were on hand. Elowen did not stand and watch them do it. She worked beside them, doing the parts her body could reach, moving material with the mules, mixing the mortar clay the way Orson showed her with movement he demonstrated twice, and then watched her repeat until he said nothing further, which was his version of approval. Her back hurt by noon. By mid-afternoon, it was speaking to her with some urgency. She acknowledged it, and kept going, adjusting how she moved, taking extra time on the transitions between bending and standing that her body had started to require. Calvin Doss noticed the way people notice things they don't mention. He rearranged the work at one point without being asked, so that the material she needed to carry was at waist height instead of ground level. She looked at him. He looked elsewhere. She said, "Nothing." And they went on, and the small accommodation was as graceful as anything that happened that entire week. The mortar cap went in on Tuesday. Orson directed it from a position 2 feet back from the junction, because that was as close as his knees would allow. And he directed it with a precision that came from 30 years of knowing exactly what he was talking about. The younger Doss brother named Ray, and the more talkative of the two, though talkative in his case meant he occasionally made brief factual observations, fitted the new cap pieces under Orson's instruction while Calvin and Elowen passed material. By Tuesday evening, the cap was in. The mortar needed time to set before they could test it. Orson sat on an upturned bucket at the edge of the cleared path and looked at what they'd done with the expression of a man reviewing work he would have done differently in some small ways, but found acceptable nonetheless. "Tomorrow," he said, "if the mortar sets right, we open the intake end and we find out." "What if it doesn't run?" Elowen asked. She kept her voice level. He looked at her. "It'll run," he said. "But what if—" "Mrs. Rusk," he said patiently, "I have laid drainage tile in 23 counties over 30 years. The tile is there. The fall is there. I checked it this morning. The only reason this field doesn't drain is the cap. Fixed." He stood up from the bucket with effort. "Run." She wanted to believe him completely. She believed him about 90%, which was the honest truth. The 10% kept her awake that night. The gravel arrived Wednesday morning, which was either good timing or the kind of mundane coincidence that feels larger in the context of everything else happening. The Doss brothers unloaded it to the edge of the cleared path, and Elowen moved it in with Cinder and Bishop, who had been resting since Monday and came to the work fresh. Cinder, she noticed, moved through the bottomland path without hesitation now. Not carefully, not testing, just moving, because he had been on the path enough times that he knew it. She watched him pick his way up the narrower section near the old sycamores, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but had elements of both. Then it was time. Orson had checked the mortar at first light and declared it set. He and Elowen and the Doss brothers stood at the intake end of the drainage system where a partially collapsed earth berm had been holding water back from the tile mouth. Calvin had a spade. Orson had his stick. Ray was positioned 20 feet back toward the creek, at the outlet end, where the original drain ran into Broken Creek, under a tangle of old willow roots. When he signals, Orson said to Elowen, meaning Ray, "That means it's moving at the outlet." He looked at the berm. "Open it up, Calvin." Calvin put the spade in. The berm was not dramatic. A few cuts, a section of packed earth folding away, and the backed-up water behind it ran toward the tile mouth with the quiet, unarguable force of water that has been waiting for an opening for a long time. They stood and watched it go in. For a moment long enough that Elowen's hands, which she had been holding still at her sides, tightened into fists. Nothing came back from Ray's direction. Then Ray called out. Not words. Just a sound, a sharp, short sound of something happening. "That's it," Orson said quietly. Elowen walked to the outlet end fast enough that she was nearly running, which was not a pace her body was endorsing, and she got there and looked at where the old clay outlet pipe met the creek bank and saw a thin stream of brown water running out of it into Broken Creek. Thin, not impressive. Not a flood, not a gush, a thin stream, cloudy with disturbed silt, finding its way. She watched it. Ray stood beside her watching it too. Stream thickened. Not quickly in the slow, deciding way of water, finding a channel it hasn't used in years. A little more again. "It's running," Ray said. "Yes," Elowen said. Her voice was even. She had practiced, over the years, keeping her voice even when things happened that she had been working toward for a long time, and the inside of her chest was doing something that did not lend itself to being even. She stood at the creek bank and watched the water run. Orson came up beside her, slower, using his stick on the uneven ground near the willow roots. He looked at the outlet for a long moment. "Told you," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, not at her, and his face had an expression she recognized because she had seen it before on her father's face, on Harlan's, on the faces of old men who have spent their lives doing difficult work that most people don't understand and have learned not to expect much acknowledgement for it. It was the expression who has just watched something work the way it was supposed to work and found that sufficient. "You did," she said. They spent the rest of that day and the following day laying the gravel bed along the main drain line and clearing the secondary silt buildup that the running water was already beginning to dislodge. By Thursday afternoon, the water that had been standing in the lowest sections of the bottomland was visibly moving. Not fast, not dramatically, but moving. On Friday morning, she walked into the bottomland without her stick. The ground where she had worn her boots through to the ankle in October held her. Not perfectly, there were still soft spots, still places she tested before committing, but the worst of the saturation was already responding. Along the main drain line, which ran roughly down the center of the field, the ground was firming in a way she could feel under her boots. She walked further than she had ever walked in the bottom land without getting stuck. She kept going until she was in the center of the field, more or less the real center, the middle, of the 112 acres that her father had believed in, and nobody else had bothered with, and she stopped. She bent down and pushed her right hand into the soil. It was wet, still cold, but it had the give of earth that water is leaving, not earth that water has claimed permanently. Pushed her fingers deeper and brought up a handful and looked at it. It was nearly black. She had seen this trefesp. Once, when she was a child, her father had crouched beside her at the edge of this same field and lifted a handful of soil from a spot where the ground happened to be dry enough to reach, and he had held it up to the light. That color, exactly that color. She stayed crouched in the middle of the field for a long time, looking at what she had in her hand. She was not a woman given to ceremonies. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She set the soil back down, pressed her palm flat against the surface of the field for a moment, and stood up. Her back complained on the way up. Her knees were wet. There was mud on both forearms, and she had been wearing the same coat for 4 days, because she hadn't wanted to ruin another one. She looked at the field around her, all of it, as far as she could see in every direction, and understood, for the first time, not as theory or hope or plan, but as a fact she was standing inside of, what she had actually done. Then she walked back out along the buried road, past the sycamores, past the willows, out of the bottomland, and up the slope toward her farm. Temper was standing at the pasture fence watching her come. "I know," Elowen said. She went inside and changed her coat and started planning the spring planting. Planning took 3 weeks, which was longer than she wanted and shorter than she probably needed, and molt as it were dark. And the result was a set of notes that covered 6 pages of her working notebook and still felt incomplete in the ways that planning always feels incomplete when the thing you are planning has never been done before. The bottomland was draining. That was real, and she checked it every other day through the rest of April, walking the main line, watching the outlet at the creek, testing the ground with her boots and her hands. The water table was falling. The pace was not dramatic. This was not a field that transformed overnight, but it was consistent, and consistency was what she had been counting on. By the last week of April, the central section of the field had firmed enough that she could walk it without the steel rod. By the first week of May, she brought Temper in along the buried road and walked her across the center of the field, watching every step. Temper walked it without sinking. Elowen stood at the far end and looked back across the ground the mule had just crossed and understood that the calculations she had made 8 months ago, watching a mule feel its way through mud on Cartwright Road, had been correct. This was not a comfortable feeling. Correct. After that long, after that much, does not arrive as triumph. It arrives as a particular quiet, the kind that follows something that has cost a great deal and has finally resolved. She stood in the bottomland in early May and let herself feel it for about 90 seconds. Then she turned around and started thinking about what came next. What came next was the ground preparation, and it was the part of the plan she had been both most certain and most afraid of. Certain because she understood soil, and she understood mule power, and she understood that the equipment she had restored over the winter was adequate for what she needed. Afraid because There was a difference between believing a field could be broken and actually breaking it, between the theory of what this soil could become and the reality of what it currently was, which was dense, root-heavy, unworked ground that had been sitting fallow for more than 2 decades in some sections and far longer in others. Breaking new ground is brutal work. She knew this from the upland fields, from the seasons she and Harlan had spent extending the farm in the early years. It is work that punishes the equipment, punishes the animals, and punishes the person behind the plow in ways that don't fully announce themselves until the 2nd or 3rd day, when the body presents its accounting. She had 20 mules. She had time, if she was careful about it, to get seed in before the window closed. She started on a Monday in the 2nd week of May with Temper and Flint. This was the first time she had put Flint in a working pair on real ground outside the paddock, and she had thought about it for a week before deciding. He was ready. Not perfectly ready, there was no such thing with Flint, who still carried that spark of restlessness even now that he'd learned to direct it, but ready enough. And what he needed was work that demanded everything he had. Paddock had been containing him. The bottomland would use him. She hitched them to the walking plow just after sunup. The morning was cool and smelled of wet earth and the particular green smell of a field that has been wet for a long time and is now tentatively becoming something else. She set the plow at the depth she wanted, not deep, not yet, just enough to turn the top layer and seize what she was dealing with, and she asked Temper to move. Temper moved. Flint moved with her, and the plow bit into the soil, and the soil pushed back. The first furrow was a fight. The root mass in the surface layer was dense and tangled, the remains of decades of grass and sedge, and the plow bucked twice in the first 30 feet before finding its line. Most of its windows were dark. Elowen held the handles and kept her weight forward and let the mules find their footing and didn't say a word, because talking would have cost her the attention she needed for her hands and her feet and the angle of the blade. Flint hit a root mat at 40 feet and threw his weight against the collar, and for one lurching moment the whole team staggered sideways. Elowen leaned hard right, corrected the plow angle, called to him not a command, just his name, just enough to bring his attention back from the resistance to her, and he gathered himself and pulled through. The root mass tore. The plow came free. She stopped them at the end of the first furrow and stood between them with one hand on each neck and breathed. The furrow behind her was rough and uneven and would not have impressed anyone who cared about the aesthetics of plowed ground. She did not care about the aesthetics. She cared that the blade had gone in, that the soil had turned, that the earth underneath was the color she'd seen when she pushed her fist into it last month. It was that color, dark and dense and full of what good soil is full of. She asked the mules to turn. They went back down the field on the second furrow. By the end of that first day, she had covered roughly a quarter acre. It was a small amount measured against 112, but the quarter acre had told her what she needed to know. The ground would break, the mules could break it, and the soil beneath the root layer was what she had believed it was. She unhitched Temper and Flint at the barn and rubbed them down herself, both of them. The full process, not abbreviated because she was tired, because they had earned it, and she knew the difference between the work that gets done when it has to get done, and the work that gets done because it is owed. Her hands were blistered in 3 places. She hadn't bothered to notice during the day. She noticed them now. She wrapped them with cloth and ate supper standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a negotiation with her body that she wasn't sure she'd win. She did not plow alone. This was the thing she had to accept in the 3rd week of May, when it became clear that even with 2 mule teams running on alternating days, her own body was a bottleneck. One person could only work one plow. One plow in that root-heavy ground could only move so fast. The window for spring corn wasn't closing yet, but it wasn't standing still either, and the math of what she needed to cover against the time she had available was an equation with an uncomfortable answer. She hired day labor. 2 men, found through the same practical network that had produced the Doss brothers, people connected to Burrell, people who needed the wage and didn't need to understand the full scope of what they were doing. She showed them what she needed, which was a 3rd plow team running in parallel to her own, and she was direct about the conditions, which were difficult, and the pay, which was fair, and neither man pretended the arrangement was anything other than what it was. Their names were Hutchins and Cole. Hutchins was experienced with mules and required minimal instruction. Cole was not, which meant she spent the first morning running a third track herself and letting Cole watch before she handed him the lines. And even then she checked on him every 3 passes for the first 2 days until she was satisfied. He understood what Sober and Bishop were telling him through the leather. Having other people in the Bottomland was an adjustment. She had worked alone here, or near alone, for so long that the presence of other people moving through the field changed something she couldn't immediately name. Not unwelcome, but different. There was the sound of other voices, other commands to the animals, other boots on the buried road. There was the particular friction of being responsible for other people's safety on ground that she understood well, and they were still learning. She managed it. She was not the most natural supervisor. She had always been more comfortable doing than directing, but she found that being clear and specific was enough. She told people exactly what she needed, exactly why, and exactly what to watch for. Most people in her experience could follow clear and specific. Problems usually came from unclear and vague, which was a choice made out of either hurry or condescension, and she had no patience for either. By the end of May, she had broken nearly 18 acres. It was not all the Bottomland. It was not half of it. But it was more than anyone had broken there in a generation, and when she walked the turned ground in the evenings and pushed the toe of her boot into the dark soil, the resistance she felt was the right kind, the firm, promising resistance of earth that wants to be planted. Planted corn. The variety she had chosen was one that had done well for her on the upland fields in wet springs, a local strain that the county seed supplier had almost discontinued because it wasn't fashionable, which meant it was available cheaply, which had been part of her decision. The other part was that she had seen what this variety did in heavy soil, and she trusted it in a way she couldn't fully explain in terms of chemistry or agronomy. It was the trust of a person who had watched something work. She planted with 2 of the younger mules on a planter she had modified over the winter for the Bottomland row width, and the planting went faster than the breaking had, which was predictable, and smoother than she had expected, which was not. Flint pulled the planter, not temper, not sober. She had made the decision 3 days before planting started, and it had been a quiet decision made without announcement, based on nothing more than watching him work for 2 weeks in the Bottomland and understanding that he had crossed whatever line separates a young animal with promise from a working animal with ability. He was not temper. He was not going to become temper. He was going to become something else faster, more aggressive in his power, the kind of animal that covers ground, with a purpose that borders on impatience even when it is perfectly controlled. He pulled the planter down the first row, and the seed went in behind him, and she followed holding the line, and thought about the October morning she'd spent in the kitchen garden, looking at him with kale on his mouth, and the absolute certainty in that moment that she was going to regret buying him. She had been wrong about that. She was willing to be wrong about things when the evidence was clear. The corn went in over 4 days. June arrived warm and stayed that way, which was not remarkable for Tennessee in June, but the warmth combined with the moisture still held in the Bottomland soil produced something in the planted rows that Elowen had expected intellectually and still found startling when she walked the field and saw it with her own eyes. The corn was coming up faster than anything she had grown on the upland fields. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have made a person stop in their tracks and stare. But she had been farming long enough to know what corn looked like at 10 days and at 16 days and at 22 days, and what she was looking at in the Bottomland rows was consistently 4 to 5 days ahead of the upland planting she'd done the same week. The soil was doing what her father had said it would do. She walked the Bottomland rows every other morning and kept her notes current and said nothing to anyone except Burrell, who had come by in early June to see how the planting had gone and stood at the edge of the turned ground with the expression of a man watching something he had given up believing possible. "It's up," he said. "It's up," she said. He looked at her. Father would have... He stopped. "I know," she said. "They didn't pursue it. Some things don't require pursuit." Burrell visited Orson Pike in June and reported back that the old man had asked 3 specific questions about the drainage performance and had received the answers through Burrell and had made no further comment, which Burrell interpreted as satisfaction and Elowen accepted as high praise. The town's awareness of what was happening in the bottomland increased gradually through June. Worst of things in small towns always increases through the accumulation of individual sightings and secondhand reports that eventually reach enough people to become common knowledge. Hutchins had a wife. Cole had a mother. The Doss brothers had not been invisible on the road when they came and went. Burrell Oaks had never been a gossip, but he was a person who existed in community and community notices. By late June, Hollow Creek knew that Elowen Rusk had done something in the bottomland. They did not know exactly what. The details were various and conflicting, as details always are when assembled from multiple partial sources. Some people said she had broken 20 acres. Some said 10. Some said she'd fixed old drains. Some said she'd just been clearing brush. Some said the corn was up and looking good. Some said she'd probably jumped too fast and planted in ground that wasn't ready. Silas Venn said nothing publicly. Elowen heard this through the same osmosis that had delivered everything else, and she thought about it more than she wanted to admit. His silence was not the silence of disinterest. Silas Venn had an opinion about everything within 10 miles of Hollow Creek, and his choice not to share this one meant he was watching and waiting. She did not know exactly what he was waiting for, and not knowing made her careful in ways that were probably excessive, and possibly not. She kept the gate closed and the mules working. The summer of 1912 was hot, in the way Tennessee summers are hot aggressively. Personally hot, the kind of heat that makes every task take a third longer and every meal taste of whatever you sweated through to prepare it. Elowen worked the bottomland through it and the upland fields through it, and did not particularly enjoy either. But the bottomland had one quality the upland fields did not. In the heat of July, when she walked the corn rows in the early morning before the day became unbearable, the ground around root systems was visibly moister than the soil in her upper fields under identical conditions. The organic matter in the bottomland soil held water in a way that her hillside fields could not match. She filed this. She was filing everything. She had started, sometime in May, keeping a second notebook, not the working notes, not the accounts, but a systematic record of conditions and observations. Planting dates, soil temperature, stand emergence, plant height at intervals, moisture conditions, yield estimates as the summer progressed. She did not know, when she started it, exactly why she was keeping such detailed records. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like the kind of record that might matter to someone at some point for reasons she couldn't fully predict. In late July, a man she had never met came to the farm. He arrived in a county wagon driven by someone else, which meant he had not come on his own initiative but had been sent, and he introduced himself as Garen Foss, an agricultural agent assigned to the county extension office. He was young, younger than she expected, maybe 32, with the slightly formal manner of a man who has been given some authority recently and is still figuring out how to wear it. He had heard about the bottomland. He had been, he said, hearing about it from several people independently over the past month, and the county office had asked him to come and see. She showed him. She walked him along the buried road, completely cleared now, maintained by regular passage, and a full where the corn stood in its rows. And she watched him look at it the way she had learned to read people looking at things. He was not performing interest. He was actually interested, which changed the quality of his attention in ways she had learned to distinguish. He walked the rows. He pulled a plant and looked at the root system. He crouched down and pushed his fingers into the soil between rows and came up with a handful and looked at it. He looked at her. "How did you get in here?" he said. He gestured at the field around them. "This has been soft ground for as long as anyone can tell. How did you get equipment in?" She told him. Not the full history, not the journal. Not the 18 months of watching and planning, but the operational facts. The buried road. The mule teams. The drainage repair. He listened carefully. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and specific, which she respected. She answered them. "You did the drainage repair yourself?" he said. "With help," she said. "A retired tile lay worker named Orson Pike directed it. I provided labor and materials, and the tile system is holding? Running clean," she said. "I check the outlet twice a week." He looked round the field again. He had the quality, she decided, of someone who had been told something was impossible and was now standing inside the impossible thing, trying to recalibrate. "I'd like to come back," he said. "With someone from the state office, maybe. And I'd like to see your records if you have any." She almost smiled. "I have records," she said. She brought him to the kitchen table and set the second notebook in front of him. And the expression on his face when he opened it and saw the systematic detail inside it was one she saved carefully and did not share with anyone. He stayed 2 hours. When he left, he shook her hand and said the state extension office would be in contact, and she nodded and said that would be fine. Most of its windows were dark, and she watched the county wagon drive out through the gate with the same deliberate calm she brought to everything. And then she went inside and sat down at the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed. Not because she was overwhelmed, because she needed to keep her feet on the ground, which was a thing she had practiced and intended to keep practicing regardless of what came next. What came next arrived in the form of a dry August. It started in the first week of the month, not a dramatic break, just a gradual deficit, rain coming less often than the season called for, the intervals between storms stretching until the ground on the upland fields began to show it. The topsoil cracked in the corner of the east field by the 12th, which was earlier than she'd seen it happen in recent summers. By the 20th, her upland corn was showing stress not dying. Not yet. But the leaves were rolling in the afternoons, and the color had shifted from the deep, healthy green of a well-watered crop to something slightly yellow at the edges. She walked the upland rows and felt the worry she always felt in a drought, which was the worry of a person for whom crop failure was not an abstraction, but a number that translated directly into a bank payment she might not be able to make. Then she walked the bottomland. The contrast was not subtle. The bottomland corn was still green. Not the aggressive green of a crop in ideal conditions. The dry air had touched it too, had slowed it slightly, but green. Standing upright, the leaves were not rolling. She went down the rows and checked soil at the root zones and found moisture at 4 inches where the upland fields were dry at 2. The organic matter was doing what organic matter does. She stood in the middle of the bottomland corn in the dry August heat and understood something that she had theorized and had not been able to test. Until this moment, the bottomland's value was not just about its fertility. It was about its resilience. A field that had been wet for 30 years had stored organic matter in a density that upland fields, regularly worked and regularly depleted, could not match. That organic matter held water against drought, the way a sponge holds water not indefinitely, not against everything, but longer, and that longer was the difference between a crop that made it and a crop that didn't. She walked back to the house and sat with the accounts for a long time. The upland corn was going to come in short. She had known this since the second week of August, and had been adjusting her estimates accordingly. The shortfall would hurt. It would not, if the bottomland held, break her. The bottomland corn at current stand, and the growth she'd been tracking, was projecting a yield per acre that, if it came in even at 80% of her estimate, would offset most of what the upland was going to miss. She sat with the numbers until she was satisfied she had them right. Then she went out to the pasture, because the evenings were when she thought most clearly, and she leaned on the fence and looked at her mules in the late summer light. All 20 of them, present and accounted for, which had not been guaranteed in September when they arrived and was now simply a fact. Temper was at the water trough. She had slowed noticeably since spring, not sick, not declining in any alarming way, just aging, the way good working animals age, with a gradual redistribution of their energy toward stillness. Elowen had started limiting her workload in July. Not because Temper couldn't still work, she could, and she knew it, and she registered Elowen's decisions about her assignments with a look that was equal parts dignity and mild protest, but because Elowen's Temper had earned the right to have her work chosen for her rather than simply assigned. Flint was across the pasture, doing what Flint did in the evenings, which was move. He was never completely still. Even resting, there was always some motion, a turn of the head, a shift of weight, a step that had no particular destination. It was the nature of him. She had stopped trying to interpret it as a problem and had accepted it as a characteristic. The way you accept that some people tap their feet when they're thinking. It didn't mean anything was wrong. It just meant he was Flint. Cinder was near the barn shelter, standing with the undemonstrative composure he had been building all year, the compressed heat of him no longer available to everyone who came near, but still there, just redirected. She had put him on some of the heaviest, hauling through the summer, the repeat gravel loads for the drain bed maintenance, the heavy equipment moves during the field expansion, and he had done it with a steadiness that had quietly impressed her every time, though she had not said so to him directly, 'cause she was not entirely sure that was how it worked with mules. She looked at all of them and thought about what Silas Venn had said. In September of last year, 20 mules nobody in this county would take for free. He hadn't been entirely wrong. Nobody had wanted them. She had wanted them. She had known what she wanted them for, which was different from wanting them in the sentimental way, and she had worked to make them into what she needed, and they had become what she needed, and in the process of becoming that they had become something else. 220 animals that knew her voice, that responded to her presence, that had learned a job nobody had asked them to do before, and done it well. She pushed off the fence and went inside. The August drought ran until the first week of September, when 2 days of slow, steady rain came through and settled the dust and saved the worst of the upland corn from complete loss. It was not to rescue the upland crop was going to be poor, and she knew it, and she had already made the adjustments in her planning that a poor upland crop required. But it was enough to prevent the worst outcome. The bottomland corn came in the last week of September. She hired Calvin and Ray Doss again for the harvest, and Hutchins, and a fourth man Hutchins vouched for, whose name was Pear, and who turned out to be, like most people Hutchins vouched for, exactly what he represented himself to be. They worked the bottomland rows with the harvest equipment drawn by Cinder and Bishop and the 2 dark gray mules, Wick and Wander, who had been problem mules in September of last year and were now the most reliable hauling pair on the farm. The harvest took 4 days. She did not know the full yield number until the evening of the 4th day, when she sat at the kitchen table with her records and the tallies from the Doss brothers and ran the calculation 3 times. Because the first 2 times she thought she had made an error. She had not made an error. The bottomland corn had come in at roughly twice the per-acre yield of her best upland field under a comparable season, in a drought year, on ground that had not been farmed in 30 years, on ground that everyone in Hollow Creek had agreed was worthless. She sat with the number for a long time. It was real. She checked it again. It was real. She put down the pencil and looked at the kitchen, at the lamp on the table, at the old journal beside it, at the coat hanging by the door with the brown thread repair at the elbow, at the boots on the mat that were carrying approximately the same mud they always carried, no matter how many times she cleaned them. Nothing in the room had changed. Everything had changed. She was not a woman who cried easily. She was not crying now. But something in her chest had shifted, something that had been held carefully in a particular configuration for a very long time, and the shift was physical, the way the release of sustained tension is always physical. Her shoulders dropped about half an inch. She noticed this because she had not known they were that high. She let herself sit there. Outside, the September evening was cooling toward the kind of fall night that smells like turned earth and wood smoke, and the particular sharpness of air that has done its summer work and is now resting. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the mules moved, and another answered with a soft sound. She reached out and opened her father's journal, to the back pages the blank ones, the ones he had left, which she had been leaving too without entirely deciding to. She picked up the pencil. She wrote the date. She wrote the yield number. She wrote, in the same small, careful letters she had developed over years of keeping records that needed to last, bottomland harvest, first season, soil performed as expected, drainage holding, mule teams intact. All 20. She paused. Then she wrote one more line. Father was right about the soil. She closed the journal and set the pencil down. She went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. And she slept without the accounts running behind her eyes, which was its own kind of measure of where things stood. The word got out the way words always get out in small places, not all at once. Not in any single conversation that anyone could later point to and say that was the moment, but gradually, through accumulation, the way water finds a crack and widens it over time without anyone watching it happen. By the first week of October 1000, 912. Enough people in Hollow Creek had heard enough pieces of the story that the composite picture, while still incomplete in its details, was accurate in its essential shape. Elowen Rusk had done something with the bottomland. The bottomland that nobody could work. The bottomland that everybody had agreed, for as long as anybody could remember agreeing about anything, was a lost cause. The widow with the 20 unwanted mules had gone in there and done something, and whatever she had done had produced a corn harvest that the Doss brothers, who were not given to exaggeration, most of its windows were dark, which was part of why people listened when they talked, had described in simple terms as better than anything they'd worked in 3 years. People came to look, not all at once, not in any organized way. They came the way curious people come to things in small communities individually, or in pairs, under the cover of some adjacent errand that gave them a reason to be on the road near her property. A wagon that happened to slow down near the gate. A man on horseback who stopped to water his animal at the creek that ran beside the south fence line and found himself looking at the harvested bottomland from a distance. Elowen noticed them. She always noticed things. She did not go out to meet them, and she did not pretend they weren't there. She had work to do, and she did it, and if people wanted to look at a field that had already been harvested, there was nothing much to see except turned earth and the end-of-season residue of a corn crop that had come and gone, and she figured that was probably clarifying in its own way. What she did not expect, what she had not fully prepared herself for, which was a failure of imagination on her part. And she acknowledged it was Dorothea Crail. Dorothea came on a Thursday in the second week of October, not driving past or slowing down on the road, but actually coming up the path to the front door and knocking, which indicated a level of intent that casual curiosity did not explain. Elowen answered it with her hands, carrying the smell of the harness oil she'd been working with, which she didn't apologize for. Dorothea looked at her. She had the slightly compressed expression of a woman who had prepared several things to say and was now deciding on the order. I heard the yield numbers, she said. People talk, Elowen said. Elowen. Dorothea stopped. She was not, underneath the layers of town voice and appointed authority, a stupid woman. She was a woman who had organized her world around certain assumptions and was now holding one of those assumptions up to light and finding it transparent in ways she hadn't expected. I said some things. Last fall, when the mules arrived, I said some things I wasn't kind about it. Elowen waited. I thought you'd made a terrible mistake, Dorothea said. I thought you were going to lose the farm, and I suppose I thought I was being realistic, preparing you. She stopped again. I wasn't being realistic. I was being the same as everyone else, which was deciding what you could do before you'd done it. It was not a comfortable speech for Dorothea to give. Elowen could see the discomfort clearly, the way she could see most things clearly, and she did not enjoy it. She had thought, in September of last year, that she would enjoy this if it ever came. She'd been wrong about that, too. You don't owe me anything, Elowen said. You thought what you thought. Most people thought the same. That's not a defense, Dorothea said. No, Elowen agreed. It isn't. They stood at the door for a moment that had some weight to it on both sides. Would you like coffee? Elowen said. Dorothea came in, and they sat at the kitchen table where Elowen had spent so many evenings alone, with her notebooks and her numbers, and they drank coffee and talked for an hour in the careful, slightly formal way of two women who are not close friends and are not going to become close friends, but have discovered a small and genuine respect for each other that neither had expected to find. Dorothea asked practical questions: how the drainage worked, how the mule teams were organized, how she had found the road, and Elowen answered them plainly, without embellishment, without false modesty, and without any of the performance that the situation might have invited. She had not done this to impress Dorothea Crail. She had done it because the land needed it done, and she was the one who understood how to do it. Those were the only facts that had ever mattered. When Dorothea left, she shook Elowen's hand at the door, which was not a gesture she offered to many people, and Elowen received it the same way. She received most things steadily, without making it larger than it was. She watched the wagon go down the road and went back to the harness oil. Garin Foss came back in mid-October, as he had said he would, and he brought a man from the state agricultural office named Whitmore, no relation to the Whitmore property near Orson Pikes, Just a coincidence of names who was older and quieter and spent 3 hours in the bottomland with a soil probe and a set of notes that he guarded with his coat against the October wind. Most of its windows were dark. Elowen walked them through everything. She had decided sometime in late September that she was not going to be protective about what she had learned. The information in her notebooks, the methods she had used, the drainage repair process, the mule training approach, the road discovery, all of it was available to anyone who asked in good faith. She had not invented the mule. She had not invented drainage tile. She had not invented patience or observation, or the willingness to take something seriously that other people had dismissed. These were not things that could be owned. They were things that could be shared, and if sharing them meant someone else's abandoned land became productive, that was not a cost to her. That was the whole point. Whitmore asked her if she had considered writing up her methods formally. She said she had not, but she would consider it now that he mentioned it. He said the state's office would be interested in a formal account not immediately, not this season, but when she had time. He said what she had done with the drainage restoration on soft ground using draft animals was not widely documented, and that there were other bottomland fields across the state in similar situations abandoned for similar reasons, and that her approach might have applications beyond this particular farm. She listened to this carefully. "I'm a farmer," she said, "not a writer." "Your notebook suggests otherwise," Whitmore said. She thought about her father's journal, the pages he'd filled with careful observation across 30 years of thinking about this land. She thought about the note she had written in the back of it. In September, Father was right about the soil. "I'll think about it," she said. Whitmore nodded. He understood when a conversation was over. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the bottomland one more time and looked at the harvested field in the flat October light, and he said something that was not directed at her, specifically. Not really, it was the kind of thing people say when they're thinking out loud and have momentarily forgotten they're not alone. 30 years, he said. This ground was sitting here for 30 years. More than 30, Elowen said. In some sections, longer. He shook his head once, not in disbelief. In the particular way of someone who understands both the waste and the fact that the waste is over. They drove away. In the county wagon, and Elowen stood at the gate and watched them go, and thought about other fields and other places where the answer was already buried in the ground, and nobody had found it yet. Silas Venn came in November. She had been expecting him in the way she expected weather, not knowing the exact day, but understanding from the patterns and the pressures that it was coming. He did not send word ahead. He rode up to the gate on a Tuesday morning when the air had the first real cold of autumn in it, and the sky was the pale, washed-out blue of late fall, and he sat on his horse for a moment before he dismounted, which was a thing she noticed. Came up the path on foot. She came out to meet him because she had been watching from the window, and she preferred to have this conversation outside, in her own yard, standing, rather than inside where she would have had to offer coffee and chairs and all the equipment of hospitality. He stopped a reasonable distance from her. Not 6 feet this time. Further back than that. Something in his posture had changed. From the morning he had walked through her gate uninvited and looked her up and down like a bad investment. He was still a large, prosperous man, still standing with the particular ease of someone accustomed to owning things. But the certainty that had made him careless the first time was not as visible today. "Elowen," he said. "Silas," she said. He looked toward the south pasture, toward the general direction of the bottomland, though you couldn't see it from here. Then he looked back at her. "I came to tell you something," he said. "Not to ask anything. Not to offer anything. Just to tell you." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "About the mules. About the bottomland. About what you could do with it." He said it without decoration. He had clearly decided in advance not to complicate it with qualifications, and he held to that decision. "I've been farming this county for 20 years, and I didn't see what you saw. I didn't look at it the right way." He paused. "I didn't look at you the right way." The last sentence cost him something. She could see it cost him something. She did not make it easier. "No," she said. "You didn't." He accepted that. He had come prepared to accept it. "What you did with that road," he said. "The drainage. The mule teams on ground that nobody could get equipment into. I've been trying to understand how you thought of it, and I keep getting to the part where I didn't think of it myself and having to sit with that. You had the same bottomland soil I had, she said. You had more equipment than I had and more men. You had the resources to try it. I know, he said. You didn't try it because you'd already decided it wasn't worth trying, she said. Because the people before you had decided the same. Because that's easier than looking at a problem from a different direction. He was quiet. I'm not saying this to wound you, she said. I'm saying it because it's true and because I think you know it's true, and I don't believe it serves either of us for me to pretend otherwise. He looked at her for a long moment. Silas Venn was not. She had always known a bad man. He was a limited man who had not often encountered his own limits, and encountering them, now at 45, was a different experience than encountering them young would have been. Less flexible, more expensive. But he was standing in her yard in the cold and saying what he had come to say, and that counted for something, even if it didn't count for everything. Elowen, he said, you knew what you were doing. Yes, she said. Hollow Creek couldn't see it. No, she said. Couldn't. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. For what it's worth, the men who laughed. The things that were said. He stopped. I'm sorry for my part in it. She did not say so was nothing. It had not been nothing. It had been months of carrying other people's doubt on top of her own, which is a particular kind of weight that people who have never carried it tend to underestimate. She had managed it, but managing it had cost her something, and she was honest enough with herself to know that. I accept that, she said. It was not forgiveness delivered warmly. It was acknowledgement specific, real, without performance. The kind of acknowledgement that Silas Venn, whatever his faults, was probably capable of recognizing the value of. He nodded again. He walked back to his horse and mounted and rode out the gate, and she watched him go the same way she had watched him go a year ago in September, except that this time the thing she felt in her chest was different, weeder, settled in a way the first time had not been. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a minute, not doing anything, just sitting. Then she opened the working notebook to the current page and picked up her pencil and went back to the fall planting plans, because the second season's clover cover crop for the bottomland rotation was not going to plan. Orson Pike came to the farm exactly once in November, and it was not a visit she had arranged. She heard the wagon coming up the road and looked out the window and saw the old man being driven by a young woman she didn't recognize, a granddaughter, as it turned out, who had agreed to bring him without asking too many questions. He got down from the wagon slowly, using the wheel hub as a step, and came up the path with his stick. Opened the door before he knocked. I wanted to see it, he said, by way of explanation. The field. She took him down to the bottomland. She didn't hurry him, and she didn't offer to help him on the uneven ground because she had read him well enough by now to understand that offering help he hadn't asked for was a form of insult. He used his stick and his own judgment and made his way along the buried road, fully cleared now, maintained, wide enough for a cart to the harvested field. He stood at the edge of it. The bottomland in November was not the bottomland of spring, when the turned earth was dark and the seed was going in, or the bottomland of August, when the corn stood in its rows against the drought. It was a harvested field in late autumn, which meant it was residue and turned earth, and the particular quiet that farmland has after the work of the season is done, and before the next season's work begins. Not spectacular, not the kind of view that makes a person catch their breath. Orson looked at it for a long time. Running clean, he said. The drainage. Running clean, she said. He prodded the soil near his feet with the tip of his stick. He looked at the color of the exposed earth. He looked at the line of the old buried road, and the way it reached into the field and disappeared at the far edge. My daddy did tile lay work, he said, and his daddy before him. Spent 30 years of my life putting tile in the ground so water would move the way it was supposed to move. He paused. Most of those tiles are running somewhere underneath ground that nobody thinks about. Nobody goes looking to see if the work held. Nobody knows there was ever a problem. He looked at the field. This is the first time I've seen the work matter in a way that showed. She didn't say anything. He wasn't talking to her. Not really. He was talking to the field, and she was witnessing it, which was a different thing. You gave it another chance, he said. And this he did say to her, turning slightly. The field did the work, she said. We just cleared what was in the way. He made a sound that was not quite disagreement and not quite agreement. The sound of a man who has a more complicated view of the matter, but has decided not to spend the time arguing it. They walked back to the farmhouse, and she gave him coffee, and he sat at her kitchen table and looked at the notebooks she'd been keeping. She put them in front of him because she thought he'd want to see them, and she was right, and he read through sections of the observation records, with the focused attention of someone to whom the details were not abstract. He paused at the section where she'd recorded the drainage performance through the August drought. He read it twice. "This needs to go somewhere," he said. "This information." "Whitmore from the state office said the same thing," she said. "Whitmore's right," Orson said, which was, she suspected, not a sentence he used often about people from state offices. He left in the early afternoon, his granddaughter coming around to help him back into the wagon without being asked and without making it look like helping, which showed a certain practiced skill. He did not say goodbye in any formal way. He raised his stick once as the wagon pulled away, which she took as the equivalent. She stood at the gate and watched until the wagon turned onto the main road. She thought about a generation of tile workers whose names nobody remembered. She thought of the man who had built the buried road, whoever he was, someone who needed to move through this field regularly enough to make the effort of building a firm path. Someone laid stones and packed earth by hand and had done a job solid enough that it lasted 100 years underground and still held her weight and her mule's weight and a loaded cart. She thought about her father, crouching beside a child with a handful of black soil, saying this could grow anything. None of those people were present to see the field that their accumulated work had made possible. This was a thing she had been thinking about since September, not with sadness, exactly more, with the particular quality of attention that comes from understanding that you are working inside a long chain of other people's efforts, some of which you can trace and some of which you will never know. The buried road had been there. The tile system had been there. The soil had been there. Her father's observations had been there. What she had contributed was the willingness to bring these things together and the stubbornness, or the patience. She was never entirely sure which word was more accurate to work toward it when everything and everyone suggested she should stop. She had not done this alone. She was clear about that in her own mind in a way she intended to be clear about on paper, in whatever account she eventually wrote for the state office. The Doss brothers, Orson Pike, Burrell Oakes, who had stood at a fence line and told her she was going to need help before she was ready to admit it. Calvin, who had quietly rearranged heavy material to a height that saved her back, without making her acknowledge that her back needed saving. Even Silas Venn, in a backwards way, his certainty that she would fail, had clarified her thinking more than encouragement might have, because certainty that demands to be disproven has a particular focusing effect on a mind that is already pointed in the right direction. She went back to work. The second season, the 913 growing season, was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. She had expanded the broken bottomland through the winter, hiring out the heaviest clearing work to the Doss brothers through a standing arrangement that suited all parties, and by spring planting she had nearly 40 acres ready, rather than the 18 she'd planted the first season. She rotated the second-year corn on the new ground, clover on the first season acres, which was the beginning of the soil management plan she had worked out over the winter, with more notes, more calculation, and one long letter to Whitmore at the state office that ran to 6 pages, and received a 3-page reply that contained 2 corrections to her chemistry assumptions, and several questions she hadn't thought to ask, which she found more useful than agreement would have been. She planted the 40 acres in May. She continued maintaining the upland fields in the way she had always maintained them. Because the bottomland did not replace the upland farm, it completed it. A mixed operation, high ground and low ground, each with its own strengths and vulnerabilities, was more stable than either alone. She also, for the first time in 7 years, hired a regular farmhand. His name was Tolliver, just Tolliver, which was apparently all of it, and he was 24 years old, and had grown up on a farm 2 counties east and had come to the Hollow Creek area looking for work without much expectation of finding the kind that suited him. He suited Elowen because he was quiet, he was good with animals, and when she showed him something once, he did not need it shown to him again. She paid him fairly which she could now afford to do, and she was direct with him about things, which he received without visible difficulty. She showed him the mules with the same attention she had given them herself. She was not trying to replicate her relationship with the animals that was hers, built over 2 years of specific work, and it was not transferable wholesale. What she was trying to give him was the fundamental respect for what the animals were and what they could do, which was the foundation everything else had been built on. Tolliver took to Flint, which surprised her, and then, on reflection, didn't. Flint was still Flint, the restless energy, the constant motion, the spark that had never burned down to ember, no matter how much work he did. Tolliver was under the quiet a similar kind of person. She had not noticed this immediately, but she noticed it watching them together in the paddock, one morning in early May, and after that she assigned Tolliver to work with Flint specifically, which freed her to focus on the Bottomland expansion and the documentation work she had been doing for the state office. Temper, she continued to manage herself. The old mule was slower now, in a way that had become impossible not to notice. She still moved with the same quality of deliberate attention that had made her invaluable on uncertain ground. But the distances she covered in a day had shortened, and there were mornings when she did not come immediately to the fence when Elowen appeared with the morning feed, when she stood at the back of the pasture and considered her options before making the walk. Elowen did not call her. She waited. Temper always came. She just came in her own time now, and Elowen had adjusted everything that needed adjusting to accommodate this fact. She gave Temper the south pasture corner, which got the most morning sun. She gave her the best quality hay, sorted by hand from the rest. She made no announcements about any of this. It was simply what was done. June was good. July was good. August brought another dry stretch, not as severe as the previous year, but noticeable, and the bottomland held again through it, and the clover on the first season acres fixed nitrogen in the soil the way the rotation plan called for, and most of its windows were dark, and when she walked the rows in mid-August, there was nothing to see but health, the kind of undramatic, unglamorous health that is the best possible thing a field can offer in a difficult summer. Windows woes were dark. She was walking the bottomland rows on a Thursday afternoon in late August when she saw someone standing at the edge of the field. It was not anyone she recognized immediately. A young woman, maybe 20, standing at the boundary between the cleared path and the open field with the expression of someone who has been working up to something for longer than they've been standing there. Elowen walked toward her. "I'm sorry," the young woman said when she was close enough. "I don't mean to trespass. I came down from the road. I wanted to see it." "See what?" Elowen asked. "The field." The young woman looked at it, the rows of clover on the near side, the corn beyond it, the dark soil visible in the paths between. "My grandfather farmed the Oaks property. Burrell Oaks is my grandfather. He told me what you did here." She looked back at Elowen. "He said most of it found a road that nobody knew was there, and you fixed what was broken underneath the field, and you used mules to do it when everyone said it couldn't be done." Elowen looked at her. "He told me because I have a piece of land," the young woman said, "on my husband's family's property. It's bottomland, about 30 acres, and it's been soft for as long as anyone knows. And I've been told it's not worth trying." She stopped. "Burrell said to come and see you. He said you would tell me the truth about whether it's worth trying." The afternoon light was flat and warm, the kind of August afternoon that goes on longer than you expect it to, and then ends more quickly. Somewhere in the field, a grasshopper moved through the corn rows with its particular ratcheting sound. Elowen looked at this young woman for a long moment. She thought about September 911. 20 mules in a pasture nobody wanted them in. A journal on the kitchen table with a faded diagram. A field that everyone had agreed was finished. She thought about the particular cost of being told you're wrong before you've had a chance to try. The way that cost accumulates over time, quietly, in the body and in the part of the mind that keeps track of what it is and is not allowed to expect from itself. "Come to the house," Elowen said. "I'll show you the notebooks." The young woman's name was Clara. She sat at the kitchen table where Silas Venn had sat and told Elowen she was going to run out of money before spring, where Dorothea Crail had drunk coffee and recalibrated, where Orson Pike had read the drainage records, where Elowen herself had sat alone through more evenings than she could count, and she looked at the records and the diagrams and asked questions that were intelligent and specific, which told Elowens something important about her. They talked for 2 hours. Elowen told her what she had learned. Not in a formal way, she was not a teacher, had never tried to be. She told her the way she would have wanted someone to tell her. 7 years earlier, before Harlan died, and the farm and the debt and the doubt had all arrived at once, plainly, specifically, without softening the hard parts or dramatizing the parts that were actually manageable. She told her about the steel rod for probing, about the mule teams and how they needed to be built, not just assembled, about the mortar mix Orson had showed her, about the records and why the records mattered, not just for documentation, but for the farmer's own sanity, for having something solid and numerical to hold on to, on the nights when the doubt came back, which it would, which was not weakness, but simply the nature of doing something that hasn't been done before. Most of its windows were dark. She told her about the night she'd lain awake running numbers, and the morning she'd gotten up and gone back to the notebook. She told her that the mules had eaten through her reserve, and she'd had to pay for the drainage work from money she'd been calling her margin, and that there had been moments were dark, and that there had been a 2-month period in the winter of 1911 where she'd known with complete clarity that if any one thing went seriously wrong, she would not be able to recover it. She told her all of that because it was true, and because knowing it was survivable was information. Clara listened. She asked 3 questions that showed she had understood the important parts. When she left, she said she was going to look at her bottomland, the way Elowen had described, with a steel rod from its edges at different water levels, trying to find whether there was structure underneath. She said she was going to talk to her husband. Elowen said that was the right order of things. She watched Clara walk back down toward the Farmland, something she hadn't expected to feel not satisfaction exactly, though there was some of that. Something more like continuity. The sense of a line extending forward from a point she had not fully understood until right now was a point worth extending from. She went back inside. The autumn harvest of 1913 came in on a clear October, and the numbers were not a surprise this time. She had been tracking the bottomland's performance since spring with enough regularity that the final tallies were already within a narrow range of what she'd written in her projections in June, which was its own quiet measure of how well she had come to know this ground. 40 acres at better than twice the upland yield per acre. The clover rotation had done what she'd predicted it would do to the first season soil, and the second season corn on those acres came in even richer than the first. The drain was running clean. The buried road was maintained and functional and wide enough now for a full cart and a pair of mules abreast. The bank payment for November was made from the harvest proceeds, with enough remaining to clear the February payment ahead of time, which she did because carrying debt forward when you had the means to retire. It was a habit she had no interest in continuing. Most of its windows were dark. The farm's financial situation was not comfortable in the way that money in a bank that you don't have to think about is comfortable. It was secure in the way that a thing you built yourself and understand completely is secure, not fragile, because fragile things collapse when pressed, and this had been pressed and had not collapsed. She sat with the accounts in the first week of November and put the ledger book away when she was done, and did not take it out again for the rest of the month. Garen Foss came by in November with a letter from Whitmore at the state office acknowledging receipt of her formal written account of the Bottomland Drainage Project, which she had completed in September after 2 months of drafting and revising. The letter said the account would be shared with other county agents and would be available to farmers on request. It said the methods she had documented represented a practical approach to reclaiming soft bottomland that had not been formalized before, and that the state office considered her contribution to the record valuable. Garen handed her the letter and stood at the gate while she read it. Whitmore doesn't write letters like that to many people, he said. He's particular about what he considers worth saying. I know, she said. I read his letter to me. Garen smiled. He had become, over the past year of visits and correspondence, something close to what she would call an ally. Not a friend in the full sense, not yet, but someone who engaged with her work with genuine interest and without the layer of skepticism that she had learned to expect as the baseline from anyone she hadn't yet shown results to. He was learning, she thought, in the way that young people with authority learn when they're paying attention, which is that authority is most useful when it amplifies something already worth amplifying. What are you doing next? He asked. She thought about Clara and the 30-acre bottomland on her husband's family's property. "I'm going to go look at someone else's problem," she said. He looked at her. "My neighbor's granddaughter," she said. "She's got soft ground she's been told isn't worth trying. I told her I'd come look at it." Garen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you go and there's something there, the state office would be interested in following the case. If you'd be willing." "I'd be willing," she said. He left, and the November afternoon settled into the kind of late fall stillness that she had come to understand. Over the years on this farm, as the land's way of taking stock, everything had done its work. Everything was resting. The account of the season was closed, and the account of the next season had not yet opened, and in between was the bare fields, the cold, clear air, the mules in the pasture with their heavy winter coats coming in. She walked down to the pasture fence at the end of the day. 20 mules. All 20. Temper was in her corner of the south pasture, in the last of the afternoon sun, standing with the absolute, experienced stillness of an old animal that has found the one warm spot in a cold field and has the wisdom to remain in it. She turned her head when Elowen reached the fence, the same way she had turned her head on the second morning, when Elowen had brought the dried apple and Temper had checked her other pocket and found nothing. Still nothing, Elowen told her. Temper looked at her for a long moment, with those calm, deep eyes that had looked at her from the beginning, with the patience of a creature that had decided she was probably worth the time if she could prove it. Then she turned back to the sun. Flint was moving across the far end of the pasture, with Tolliver keeping loose pace alongside him, the two of them doing what they always did in the evenings, going nowhere in particular, at speed, because Flint had never fully made peace with standing still, and Tolliver had apparently decided that was acceptable company rather than a problem to correct. She watched them and thought about the kale. About the morning, she'd stood in the wrecked kitchen garden looking at a young mule with a piece of kale hanging from his mouth and had said, "You and I are going to have a long conversation about patience." They'd had it. It had taken 2 years. Both of them had learned something from it, she was fairly sure. Cinder stood near the gate, which was where he often stood in the evenings, not waiting for anything, not restless in the way he had been restless in the beginning, just present, in the way that a settled animal is present, which is differently from how an unsettled one is. She went to the gate, and he moved toward her, and she scratched the side of his neck, which he permitted in the full sense of the word, now not tolerated, permitted, which was different, and he made no sudden moves and did not look for an exit route and stood with her for a minute in the cold evening air. She thought about what she had told Clara at the kitchen table. She had said the mules didn't save the farm. The observation saved the farm. The mules were how I carried out what I'd observed. There's a difference. She believed that. But standing at the fence in November with 20 animals present and accounted for, she also believed that the difference was less clean than it sounded when you said it at a kitchen table. The observation had pointed her toward the mules. The mules had made the observation possible to act on. The ground had been there all along, waiting for someone to approach it in the way it required rather than the way that was convenient. You could say the land had saved the farm. You could say the mules had. You could say her father's journal had, or Orson Pike's knowledge, or Burrell Oaks standing at a fence line in October and telling her she was going to need help before she was ready to hear it. You could say her own stubbornness had, or her own grief, or the 6 years of working alone that had built in her a kind of self-reliance so deeply habitual that when the real test came, she did not think to fail before she had tried. All of those things were true simultaneously. That was the part that was hardest to explain to people who wanted the story in a simple shape. The part where what saved you was not one thing but the particular collision of many things at the right moment, your attention, your need, your history, the people who showed up, the knowledge already buried in the ground. Sky was going to orange and purple in the west, the way November skies do when the air is cold and clear, and the day is letting go of itself. She stood at the fence. She had 83 acres of upland farm. She had 112 acres of bottomland that was producing at a rate her father had believed was possible, and that she had proved was true. She had 20 mules who knew her voice and her moods and the particular way she handled a lead line, and who had carried everything she had needed, carried through terrain that machinery could not enter, in service of something that nobody in Hollow Creek had thought was worth the attempt. It was a notebook full of records that was going to help a young woman named Clara try to reclaim 30 soft acres that her family had been told to give up on. She had debt that was coming under control. She had a farmhand who was good with animals and better every week. She had the buried road cleared and maintained running through the bottomland, like an answer to a question that had been sitting there for a generation. She had her father's journal with her own notes in the back of it. She had the work of next season, which was already starting to take shape. In her mind, the expansion she was planning, the second rotation she was designing, the letter she owed Whitmore about the soil chemistry results from the Clover Acres. She had, in the plainest terms available, enough. She had built enough from what she had, using what she knew, to stand in November and look at the coming winter without the particular dread that had been her companion every November, since Harlan died. This was not a resolution in the story sense. Resolutions are clean, and nothing about farming is clean. There would be a bad season. There would be a problem she hadn't planned for. There would be a morning when the numbers didn't work, and she would have to find the answer the way she had always found it, which was by sitting with it until it became visible. There would be losses. There always were. But the ground was different now. The farm was different. She was different not in her nature, not in the essential stubbornness and observation and patience that had always been her nature. Most of its windows were dark, but in what she understood about what that nature was capable of when it was given the right problem and enough time. Hollow Creek had judged her by what it could see. It had seen a heavy woman alone on a failing farm who had spent money she didn't have on animals. Nobody wanted to work ground. Nobody believed could be worked. It had not seen the mule's feet in the mud on Cartwright Road. It had not seen the years of attention in the pages of her father's journal and the quality of specific, patient observation that had been building quietly through 6 years of working alone toward a problem that was waiting for exactly that approach. You cannot judge a field by its surface when the value is in the drainage. You cannot judge a mule by its papers when the quality is in its feet. You cannot judge a woman by what she looks like when the nature of her mind is the thing that matters. These were not lessons Hollow Creek had taught her. These were things she had already known. She had just had to find the place where they were true in a way that other people could see. The sun finished going down. She stayed at the fence a little longer, in the dark, listening into the mules settle into the evening. Temper's slow breathing from the corner, the distant movement of flint covering ground he'd already covered twice. Cinder at the gate, still and warm. Then Elowen Rusk pushed off the fence, pulled her coat closed against the cold, and walked back up the slope toward the farmhouse. And the lamp in the window and the notebook open on the kitchen table, where next season's plans were already beginning to write themselves in the margins. The trail was open. The drainage was running clean. The mules had a home. And the work, always the work, was waiting for morning.